Have you ever asked the question, a particular type of question? I'm going to take you back to the 1970s. Calvary Baptist Church Sunday school class. And I asked the teacher, what if someone, let's say they're on the other side of the world, and they never hear the message, the good news that'll save them from burning in a fiery hell forever? I'm sure many people have asked that question. And the teacher says, well, good works won't save you, because that would be one of my examples. What if they feed people or provide, let's say, housing to someone or do good works? The teacher would then say, well, God still loves them. However, if they haven't gotten the word, and if they're not officially saved, then that is their fate to burn in the eternal fire. Thus the importance of getting the message out. And that was, or something like it, was the answer that we would get. I'm sure it's a question many have had. Now today I'm going to start talking about one of the original Christian groups, ones who claim to have walked with Christ and that their scriptures reflect that, the actual messages from Jesus the prophet. And that is the Gnostics. Now let me make something very, very clear. When a lot of people think of the Gnostic Christians, Gnostic coming from the word gnosis, which means knowledge, they think of perhaps a renegade, ragtag group of mystics, as they were of a mystical nature, and were all about experience. I will get into that in a bit. Here's the part I want to drive home. This was not a small minority group. No. The Gnostics were very much melted into the fabric of all early Christianity. They were not a small group of renegades. Even myself, up until later in life, may have thought this, like it was a small group of sort of Christian mystics who were then called heretics for some of the things they believed in, and then were executed. I'll get to that a little bit later. What I want to drive home is this was not a minority group. Let's start at the start. The prophet Jesus himself, and where he came from, and how this could have formed into what we would see as the Gnostic viewpoint, perhaps being more accurate. The Christian mystic viewpoint. Again, it was once very entrenched into society, and I'll get to a little bit of that in just a moment. Let's get to some background. In 4 BCE, that's right, there's some calendar debates, folks. I won't go into that now. They say a monk made a calendar mistake. Well, let's not get into that now. Born in Galilee. Galilee was a town of diverse religions. So this is the backdrop that Jesus was born into. It was very diverse. It was coastal. So this town, it included Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and of course, Judaism and Greek and pagan philosophies. This is the backdrop of where the Savior comes from. Again, coastal trade, coastal trading town. It was a hub. Town I live in is nicknamed Hub City. It was not some isolated place in the desert that some may think when they think of the birth. No, he was born into, at the time, what would be considered a modern and happening trading hub. And again, not an isolated place. His teacher was John the Baptist, who was very much an end times teacher, and Jesus would move on from that teacher, but of course, he was good for the time. You know how that goes in life. We have different mentors that are good for certain things and certain times in our life. Now, getting into the idea of, so he ends up with a mentor. He's in a town of multiple faiths, multiple religions, including, as I said, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, Greek pagan, Judaism, and in more sophisticated places like this, scholarship and debate were actually more encouraged. He preaches in Judea, and he preaches more in the direction of teachings of the heart is more important than things like rules, dogmas, or things such as a one clear path. It was more of an internal looking into the soul, into the heart. And as this happened, as he went out to do his own ministry, of course, it came along with, as would just be normal and natural, all of this combined philosophy that he grew up with. Again, Hinduism with a focus on reincarnation and elevation. Zoroastrianism, which was one of the early, not exactly monotheistic, there's some debate on that title, won't do that now. Then, of course, Greek and pagan philosophies, which would utterly and completely be open to things such as using magic and different forms of mysticism, and as well as Judaism, which was highly philosophical, encouraged debate. One thing about even ancient Judaism, yes, it highly encouraged debate. That's why some people even debate that it was, in fact, was it the Pharisees, the Jewish, that even turned over a fellow Jewish person to the Romans, because it was considered that we don't turn in our own to authorities. So even if they had dealt with them, they may have dealt with them on their own in some way. Turning them over to a foreign authority was considered very much not part of Jewish law and culture. And it was a very deep, very, very deeply felt, intense part of their core belief system. So that can take us in other directions I don't even want to go into now. I'm just giving you a background that Jesus's background was deeply diverse, and including in the old Jewish tradition, debate was highly not only encouraged, but was considered part of your development. Yes, it was considered part of how you grow. Combine that with the fact that there's also all these other faiths around as influences, it's very likely to believe that Jesus himself was a very interesting, spiritual, intellectual, philosophical human being with all sorts of interesting paths to draw from to come to his own conclusions, taking us closer to the heart. Now back to what direction I will take this. The fact that those who then later walked with him went on to become the Gnostics, or one of the paths went on to become the Gnostics. Again, I'm not trying to cover every detail of the whole thing, just kind of moving it along to make the point. And that point is this was not a small minority group of renegades. In 140 AD, a more organized group of Gnostic Christians was led by Valentinus. Valentinus, get this, now we're talking about Gnostics who believe in using magic and mysticism, inner search, inner journey, reincarnation, and more. We'll get to that. Many people most likely do not know that Valentinus, a Gnostic minister, was almost elected bishop or pope, or some version of pope of the day, almost elected as the head of the major church of the big empire. And why is that important right now? It's important right now because we as humans are still fighting some of these same exact battles. There was the more authoritarian church versus the other side, the Gnostics, who again were entrenched, melted into those societies, who believed in a more internal search without the need of all the external rules, thus not so much of a political need for the organized church. And again, I'm not bashing organized churches. I'm just giving you this history. I think church is good. I go to church. I think it's the profession of minister is honorable and all that. But moving on. So you had these two different views of faith that did live in relative peace for a pretty long time. I believe it was somewhere around 300 years. I mean, it was a long time. So this was not a small renegade oddball cult that just sort of popped up. They were genuinely in the institutions of faith. Now, Valentinus was a Gnostic, and the Gnostic Christians believed, and there were other sects of Gnostic, but let's focus right now on Valentinus. The Gnostic Christians, who, by the way, wouldn't have wanted to be called Valentinians or Gnostics, they would have just been called Christians, believed that salvation was based on personal, spiritual, ritual disciplines. They had their own rituals, like the bridal unity ritual, which would kind of maybe look something like a mystical or pagan ceremony. But they believed in these internal searches, or as Jesus said early, closer, a journey into the heart. And here I'll outline, and when I get to this outline, then you'll really understand why the Romans and the main Catholic Church decided to refer to these Gnostics who were entrenched into those societies, almost became a pope, declared them as heretics because he believed they were harder to control. Let's get into what made the Gnostics different. What made them different from, let's say, 80% of modern Christianity today. Again, I'm not bashing Christianity, I'm making an example. And this can happen with any faith. But let's move on. Okay, practices include, yes, magic, a belief in magic, and meditation, and rituals, talismans, angelic channeling and calling, and naming for the purposes of navigating their way to enlightenment through the heavenly realms, or what they called the pleroma, back to original source, back to the original God. Now here is one, a belief that the God of the Old Testament. Now, if you haven't been paying attention now, this is a huge difference between the Gnostics and what you might think of as standardized Christianity. The belief that the God of the Old Testament was in fact not the God, was not Father of Jesus. Again, that the God, the more wrathful, the more angry God of the Old Testament, was in fact not the God, not the Father of Jesus, though he was the creator of the earth. Let's just pause and move on from that. That point has been made. The God of the Old Testament was named Yaldabaoth, seen by the Gnostic Christians as jealous, powerful, and misguided, perhaps misunderstood. And there could be some good reasons for that. Yaldabaoth, or the Demiurge, as he's oftentimes referred to, this means, going back to the Greek Demiurgus goes, I just butchered that. Demiurge originally coming from the Greek meaning craftsman. Here's the thing. You might be thinking, okay, well, he's powerful. So this God, the wrathful God of the Old Testament, and so many of us, of course, if you grew up Christian, then believe he sent his son. His son is a little more peaceful, a little more passive, right? In the Gnostic Christian belief system, it wasn't his son. That was a different being. The Demiurge, I'll explain in a minute, was not the original actual God. To put it simply, not the big guy upstairs. He's just one of the big guys upstairs, if that makes sense. He's somewhere in high up management, but he's not the final word. So the actual one, who they say Jesus was the son of, was the one great power that is even sometimes said in paganism, the one great power, the monad. The monad is the one great ultimate source. And this is the Gnostic origin, part of the Gnostic origin story. So there's a big guy above the big guy that most people would think of, to put it just real simply. And this being, this great and all-powerful being, this great and all-powerful original God lives in the place sometimes called the Pleroma. Pleroma is what some may call the source or divine source. It's a divine field of energy of all heavenly, energetic things. And think of it like this. So in their cosmology, they would think, again, now they have, another difference. They have reincarnation in their model. So you die, you go back to source. There are so many religions that say this, by the way. That's why it would make sense that this was part of original Christianity. It was Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, all those, of course, Hindu being much, much older. You go back to the source, you live a life, go back to the source, and you come back again. That's right, that is part of original Christianity. Even to take the word Gnostics out of it, it really is a part of it. Not unlike Pythagoras and the Greek Pythagorean transmigration of the soul, which is similar. And we come back in human form because that's the form we're meant to learn in and keep developing it in. I sometimes view it as it's the human body being the battery that the soul recognizes, because that's the one that's the one it returns to. And as they say, no piece of energy has actually ever been destroyed scientifically, as far as we know now. So the soul goes on, back to source, comes back as a person, to put it real simple. Back to monad, back to Pleroma. So, included in this cosmology of the Gnostics is the daughter of the monad, the daughter of the actual one great power. An aeon, and that's what the children of the one great power are called, aeon, we could maybe loosely associate them as angels, is Sophia. Sophia actually does, and Sophia is Greek for wisdom. Sophia, as it stands, does have a few surviving passages that survive in the Bible, even though so many other of the Gnostic texts were taken out of, or more accurately, not allowed into the Bible, whether it's Council Nicaea or some of the other councils where these things were decided. Again, because the Romans wanted to piece something together that they thought made people easier to control. And a bunch of people running around believing in self-empowerment and overcoming fears and inner journeys and shadow journeys and throwing a bunch of magic around. Well, that seems a little too independent and powerful for them. And then a belief in reincarnation. Well, that would lessen their fear of death. And they like to hang, dictators like to hang that over you. Anyway, moving on. She survives in a few passages. I believe it's in Proverbs, and is referred to in the regular Bible, as Lady Wisdom. And again, let me make it clear that these Gnostics, everything I just talked about, with the cosmology of the early Christians, they were not a fringe group. They were of the original teachings of Christ, though there could be some layers of debate. But if you consider the mixed background philosophically, where people believe Christ actually came from, it actually makes perfect and incredibly natural sense. He didn't grow up in this harsh, one-way environment. And again, one of the Gnostics Valentinus was almost elected as a bishop or pope. He lost by a very small margin, actually. So, as a result, these Gnostics, they were executed. They were sought out. They were hunted out. Strangely enough, one of the ways we know about them is they hid their texts. They buried them and hid them. There was still some history of them, but we got the really good history of them, one where you can kind of go to one source, and of course, at the Nag Hammadi Library. And you can look that up, the Nag Hammadi Library. It was a series of texts found actually in the 1940s. And it was these not perfectly, but it was just very well preserved. They were buried and discovered. The fact that they're discovered is an absolute miracle. In fact, if they hadn't been hidden, we probably wouldn't have known. Now, you could have maybe pieced together some other Gnostic histories and beliefs by some other literature. I mean, doing a pretty deep scholarly dive. But to find them in one, I guess, more easygoing place would be the Nag Hammadi Library, which you can go online and look at it. So kind of one of those odd scientific miracles, really, is where they were found because they were hidden. Had they not taken the time to do that, they just might have all been burned. And the Catholics, those in power, I don't want to just say Catholics, nothing against Catholics, but the people in power at the time, it was an absolute slaughter of the Gnostic original Christians. It was brutal, and it was about as complete. It was worse than anything done to the witches during the burning times. And, I want to talk about the difference between a cult-like, not occult, but just cult-like thinking versus genuine spiritual expression. Because that's what you end up with. Not all the people practicing it I'm talking about, but that's what the leaders wanted. Instead of having a genuine occult expression, which is hidden or hidden knowledge, often showing up with refined systems for personal growth, they wanted the cult without the O in front of it, which is a way of being or way of seeing that an external authority has all the answers. Oftentimes a human, again, you could even say a savior versus a great teacher. That's what Jesus was. The great teacher, or one of them, to come and help humanity. And there's debates whether it was an actual person. I actually believe he was an actual person, or at least represented a group of actual persons. So, the purpose of me beginning this is I just want people to see that there are different histories when you open yourself to looking into them. And at this point, they're not even debated. It's just a matter of whether you're allowing your lens to look at them. I don't understand why so many, well, maybe I do, but why is it so many Christians seem disinterested in the actual origin of their own religion. Isn't that a fascinating statement? They just want the fear-based. The Gnostics talk almost nothing at all about things like hell or heaven. If they mention heaven or hell, it's only in a allegorical sense of, are you closer to some form of what you might call enlightenment or further away from divinity? Hell in the Bible is only mentioned a couple times, and they were all metaphors. They were metaphors for, in some cases, very certain people, like followers of Nero. They took it, twisted it, and turned it into this thing for everybody to be afraid of. It was never mentioned as a penalty for all of us. Take the fear out of it, because it was never meant to be a fear-based faith. You see, it was propagated into being a fear-based faith. So for some of you that might think, well, Dan, you're a pagan. Why are you doing all this Christian talk? I'm telling you because the actual, in my opinion, and you can look it up yourself, the actual true origins of the true original Christians was to be much like the Eastern ways you think of, like in Taoism, Buddhism, or like in Hinduism, or in even Western esotericism or Jewish Kabbalah. They were meant to be teachings to transform a human being. People are like, oh, well, why is that important? Well, it's important to think of this: overcoming fears, overcoming our anxieties, insecurities, transformation, the ability to control and change our reality, and not to be sitting idly by waiting for a savior. And unfortunately, people do that in human form as well. My spirit guide warned me, said one of the greatest dangers is false light. And that can come, by the way, that can come from any faith. So I'm not just picking on the Christians here, but I'm talking about, why is it Christians are so disinterested in the actual origins of their own faith? Why? Because an identity and anxiety connection has been made with either the fear, hell, or I guess hoping for paradise, but it's more based on the fear. When in fact it was never really meant to be even written that way. It was misinterpreted and pretty much non-existent. It was a metaphor for very specific human beings. The beast 666, for example, is the numerological equivalent of the name of Emperor Nero. It's not the end times that's going to be stamped on your forehead and all this other. They just develop so many theories on their own. Why don't you look into the actual history, is my question that I pose, into the faith, and see how much more wickedly interesting it is, in my opinion. Anyhow, my name is Daniel Michael, and I'm here, my new home in the mountains, Hagerstown, Maryland. And it's a beautiful day out today. Well, it's about 30 degrees, but it's sunny and really nice. I've been wandering around. And I'm going to end with this. It's a Taoist thing. I don't remember the author, forgive me. When attachment to outcomes dissolves, the soul discovers fluidity. Action, yes, is required when necessary. But do not let the ego harden the soul based on a clinging to outcomes. Walk through the flame calmly. There is wisdom on the other side of this flame, though most of the growth happens inside of the flame itself. You're listening to Main Street Universe, the show and network providing you the mysteries and possibilities of the universe closer to Main Street than you may have ever imagined. And remember, you can always listen to the archives right here on YouTube at any time, which means that next week, you can listen to last week, this week, right here on the Main Street Universe YouTube page. Have a beautiful day, everyone.